When you look at a world map, you can kinda guess if a country is powerful or not just by its geography. You can even tell if it's rich or poor. Now, if you check out South Korea's geography, and you don't know much about it beforehand, you'd probably think it's a really poor country. I mean, it's a small place, around 100,000 square kilometers, about the size of the state of Indiana. But get this, 51 million people live there, which is almost 8 times the population of Indiana. Around 70% of the land is mountains, so there's very little room for farming, and the soil isn't exactly fertile either. There aren't any big mines, and as for oil and gas, you won't even catch a whiff of it, let alone find it. There's just a bit of coal, and the weather, freezing cold in winter and hot and humid in summer. Now, if you told someone these details, they'd probably say, this country must be one of the poorest in the world. But guess what? South Korea is actually the 10th richest country globally. That's a pretty high ranking for a country with these kinds of characteristics. So, what the heck made South Korea so rich and advanced? How is that even possible? Well, a lot of this country's success is tied to one company, Samsung. Yep, the same Samsung we've all heard of and probably own some products from. Let's rewind a bit. About 90 years ago, before Japan lost in World War II, the Korean peninsula was under Japan's control, and through Korea, Japan was bordering the Soviet Union. Back then, there was a city in Korea called Daegu, a poor city where the only income came from fishing and making noodles. Yeah, the kind Easterners eat a lot. Around that same time, in 1938, a guy named Lee Byung-chul founded a company called Samsung. In Korean, Samsung means 3 stars. Why 3 stars? Because Lee believed these 3 stars symbolized greatness, grandeur, and eternity. Lee Byung-chul was born in 1910, the same year Japan occupied Korea. His dad was a big landowner. Lee went to study in Japan when he was young, and when he came back, he started trading with family money. At just 28 years old, he founded Samsung. So, what was this company doing? Making electronics? Nope, nothing like that. The company was refining sugar and selling noodles, nothing even remotely related to electronics. Time flies, and we get to 1950, the year the Soviet Union had just gotten access to the atomic bomb and was feeling invincible. They made the first move into Korea and took over almost the whole country except for a small part down south. That's when the Americans stepped in and started pushing the communists back from the south. For 3 years, Soviet and American forces fought here, with control of the land going back and forth. In this brutal war, 5 million people died, many of them civilians. When the war finally ended, Korea was split into 2 parts. The North went communist, and the South went capitalist. The superpowers' greed, especially the Soviet Union's, led to a land where everyone was family being split in half, and it's been like this for 70 years. South Korea was basically a ruined country. The infrastructure was destroyed. Factories, roads, bridges, everything was gone. Here's a shocking stat to help you understand just how poor this country was. After the war, South Korea's per capita income was only $64 a year. They were poorer than many African countries. A lot of people couldn't even find food and went to bed hungry. The rest barely found enough to eat. So, what happened to Lee Byung-chul and Samsung in all this chaos? During the war, he fled to the port city of Busan, where he used the money he had to start a flour factory and just kept on working. A year after the war, in 1954, he decided to go back and restart his company, continuing to refine sugar. He also added a new side business, preparing and washing sheep's wool for textile factories. With this move, Lee turned Samsung into South Korea's 4th largest company, and a few years later, he even founded an insurance company. But remember, this company was growing in a country where poverty was everywhere. Time marches on, and we reach 1963, the year Park Chung-hee became the president of South Korea. When he took office, his motto was that South Korea's economy needed a serious boost, and they'd have to build the facilities themselves. This president's efforts were so effective that year after year, South Korea's economy kept getting better and better. But the president wasn't done. He told Korean industries, "You need to make products that we can sell to Western countries," meaning they've got to be high quality. Park Chung-hee had some seriously capitalist ideas, so he was on the lookout for laws that would reduce taxes on big companies so they could grow. This plan meant the rich would pay less tax and get even richer, while the lower classes had to pay more, kinda like in the US, where the richer you are, the less tax you pay. Park picked a few big companies and gave them tons of perks. These companies were called Chaebols. Samsung was one of these Chaebols. The government gave them low-interest loans, exempted them from taxes, and helped them with exports. All of this made South Korean companies, including Samsung, richer and richer. Let's jump to the 1970s, a decade we could totally call the electronics decade. All sorts of electronic devices were booming. Mr. Lee saw this coming and steered Samsung straight into the electronics business, moving away from the whole sugar and wool thing. The very first product Samsung Electronics made was a black and white TV, which, at first, they got the tech for from Japan, but over time, they figured out how to make everything themselves. Throughout that decade, Samsung kept rolling out product after product, from refrigerators and washing machines to microwaves, and even Korea's first color TV. Samsung grew so much that by 1978, their sales had surpassed $1 billion. President Park Chung-hee's policies also gave other companies a big boost. Meanwhile, Hyundai was also on the rise, growing right alongside Samsung. Can you believe it? In a country where, just a few years earlier, more than half the population was going to bed hungry, there were now policies in place providing jobs and keeping people from starving. As time went on, Samsung kept climbing step by step, people's lives got better, and South Korea's GDP just kept going up. In 1987, Lee Byung-chul passed away, and his son, Lee Kun-hee, took over Samsung. You could say that year was a major turning point for the company. Lee Kun-hee had a different vision. He wanted to turn Samsung into a global brand that would make waves around the world. In 1993, he gave a famous speech in Frankfurt with the slogan, "Change everything except your wife and kids." Samsung grew so much in South Korea that when they reviewed the company's growth in 2017, they found out that 20% of South Korea's entire GDP was thanks to Samsung. That's insane. To put it in perspective, in Japan, the biggest company there, Toyota, only makes up 5% of Japan's GDP. And in the US, the biggest company by GDP is Amazon, which only accounts for 2.2% of the US GDP. So yeah, Samsung is pretty much the main artery of South Korea. This huge income has also shaped the culture of South Korea. People support Samsung so much that its employees are considered high status. For example, wherever you go and say you work at Samsung, people give you instant respect. A culture that's only fueled more progress. Many South Korean students even dream of finishing their education and getting hired at Samsung. And just so you know, Samsung currently has 266,000 employees in South Korea alone. But why does Samsung need so many employees? Do you think they only make electronic devices? Wrong. In South Korea, Samsung has a hand in just about everything. Want life insurance? Samsung Insurance. Need a boat or ship? Samsung's got you. Of course, everyone knows about their smartphones, TVs, and other household appliances. And guess what? There are hundreds of amusement parks in South Korea. Who owns them? Samsung. Samsung has 59 different branches, ranging from electronics to electronic schools, robotics, lab equipment, and so much more. Each of these branches is a massive company in its own right. But Samsung's biggest success, smartphones. In 2010, Samsung introduced the first Galaxy series phones. These phones quickly became popular and turned Samsung into Apple's biggest competitor. Interestingly, Samsung shares are traded on the stock market and owned by lots of people, but the main capital and power? Still in the hands of Lee Byung-chul's son, Lee Kun-hee. All the power was in the hands of this man and his family. Lee Kun-hee passed away in 2020, and according to South Korean law, any inheritance is taxed at 50%, the highest inheritance tax in the world. But before he died, Lee Kun-hee formed a company and transferred all his wealth and power to it, which is controlled by the Lee Kun-hee family. This way, they don't pay any inheritance tax. Today, Samsung is so powerful that some young South Koreans are speaking out. saying this company has basically monopolized South Korea and gives nothing back to the government. They say government members are just puppets of Samsung, but the South Korean parliament or government, they don't dare say anything to this company because they're scared Samsung might just up and leave South Korea. They know South Korea can't survive without Samsung and would fall right back into poverty. But Samsung, they'd be fine without South Korea. At worst, they'd move their production to another country like China, and China would welcome them with open arms. In fact, Samsung even makes the people of South Korea feel grateful that it does all its production in South Korea. So, in a way, you could call this land the Republic of Samsung. Capitalist principles lead to progress, sure, but when a company gets this much control over a country, it might feel a bit uncomfortable, to say the least. That's what we call a monopoly. So, what's your opinion?